You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-Jorge, and I'm a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. This is the second instalment of our two-part conversation with Sebastian Leape, CEO of Natcap. If you haven't listened to part one yet, please do go back into our catalogue to listen to it first. Welcome back, Sebastian.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. So in part one, we talked about why companies should prioritize nature, why nature-based solutions are important in the toolkit to tackle climate change and create nature positivity, and the role of collaboration and engaging with stakeholders, supply chain, and indigenous communities. So in part two, I'd love to talk to you a bit more about policy, which we already briefly touched upon, and data relating to nature and business as well. So as the sustainability legislative landscape evolves, I imagine you're having to help clients align with certain policy directives, such as the TNFD and CSRD. So, for those who might not be familiar, could I ask you to explain to our listeners, firstly, what the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, is and who is impacted by it?
Well, I think firstly, it's got one of the worst brandings of any
It's
project
difficult to
ever.
remember. I was like
Long,
TNFD,
sounds
TFD.
boring, but it's actually so important and so interesting. And with a better name, I think you'd have everyone excited and talking about it in their spare time. So I think it's a fascinating and such an important initiative. And it's essentially trying to replicate what the TCFD did for climate for nature. The TCFD was launched about 8 years ago and laid out a framework for companies to use to report against their climate related risks and opportunities. And the TNFD does the same for nature. So it follows the same structure. It's basically telling you to disclose your organization's governance of nature related impacts, risks, and opportunities. It's asking you to think about strategy and the effects of nature related impacts, risk, opportunities on your business model and financial planning. It's asking you to describe how you think about measuring and monitoring nature-related impacts and risks. And then finally, it's asking you to disclose some targets and any metrics you use to measure things. So it's the same framework: governance, strategy, risk, and metrics and targets. But the subject is nature rather than climate. And in all honesty, I find it intellectually confusing that we started with climate and then gone to nature. It would make way more sense to actually just have one overarching framework, which is how does your business interact with nature? Because that is the higher level category. But we are where we are, and the world's a messy place, and the TNFD did their best with that reality.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And well, relatedly, we've talked about the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, many times on this podcast and already in part one. And what it does do is include nature elements that companies have to report on. So, again, for those who don't know, what elements on CSRD touch on nature? And what advice would you give then to European companies affected by CSRD who are going to have to do this for the first time?
Yeah. CSRD, again, another incredibly boring, long acronym that's hard to remember, and but at its core is something that's, I think, of potentially revolutionary importance and really interesting. So again, with a bit of branding help, I think they could have given themselves an easier ride. But CSRD is essentially a directive that requires tens of thousands of companies. We think there's going to be about 50,000 caught by it by 2028. To start reporting in a standardized, comprehensive way on their non-financial impacts, risks, and opportunities. And that means particularly on environmental issues, on social issues, and on governance issues. Within the environment, there are 5 standards. The first is climate change, which is not news to most. But then it includes a standard on pollution, on water and marine resources, on biodiversity and ecosystems, and on resource use and the circular economy. So for companies for whom these are material, it's often the first time that they're having to really measure and disclose their interactions with these other elements of the sustainability agenda. And CSRD asks you for each of these standards and elements to talk a bit about what are the material impacts, risks, and opportunities that you found to your business, and what's their impact on strategy. what are the policies, actions, targets that you're putting in place to deal with them, and what are the financial implications to your business. And so if done properly, this really is forcing you to think quite deeply about how these issues impact you, and crucially, how you impact these issues. Because one thing that CSRD does that very few other ESG sustainability frameworks have done before is they're really anchored in a concept called double materiality, which essentially means it considers not only the risks that nature or the environment pose your business, but also the impacts that your business poses to the environment. And so that two-way street makes it a much more comprehensive standard than some other things that came before it.
And I mean, you've mentioned the environmental elements, but just to bring back a point that we discussed in part one, I think S3 is affected communities, right? So also, if you're going to be including Indigenous communities much more in your dialogue, you're going to have to talk about them there. And because, of course, the environmental and nature side is also linked to the social side of sustainability, which is also covered in CSRD.
Exactly. Again, so if done properly, it should give a really holistic view of things.
Indeed. Um, so on Natcap's website, it says if you're starting to get acquainted with the emerging set of voluntary and soon to be regulated nature reporting requirements, you might have come across the terms impacts and dependencies. So, can you explain what these mean for companies in a policy context as well?
Yep. So I think the broader issue here is that nature is a new topic for most companies. In my prior life, I was a sustainability consultant at McKinsey, so I worked with many of the world's biggest companies, helping them think about sustainability, particularly focused on climate, but just starting to work on nature. And this topic is complicated. It's quite technical and requires technical expertise, but then also new types of data and lots of it to really be done properly. And so that really was where NatCat comes in, which is it helps you understand what this whole new agenda means, helps you determine how to act on it and what's appropriate for your business to do, and then brings together all the data you need in one place in a way that makes it simple, that makes it cost effective, that protects your back by making it scientifically rigorous, brings that all together in one place, and aligns very closely with the frameworks that you need to follow. So there is a kind of advisory expertise component, but then at its core, really, there is a software data component to solving this problem. And that's really what NatCat looks to do. And so, to your question, I mean, impacts and dependencies are just some of the terms that folks find confusing because they're new.
Hmm.
And impacts are essentially the changes in the state of nature that can result um, uh, as a result of an organization's actions. And they can be either positive or negative. Usually they're negative, but in theory they can be positive. And a single impact driver can be associated with multiple impacts. So, impact is basically the change in the state of nature that you're having through your actions. Dependency, in some ways, is the inverse. It's basically the aspects of environmental assets or ecosystem services that a business relies on to function. So, for example, steady water flow, high quality of water, protection from fires and floods. And without these ecosystem services, the businesses can't function or incur much higher costs. So that's what impacts and dependencies mean. And it's actually some language that now, thankfully, was defined by the TNFD and is being quite consistently picked up across this space. So whether you have to engage with nature because you want to through something like TNFD or because you have to through something like CSRD, even CSRD asks you now to measure impacts and then risks and opportunities, and is defining them all in quite a consistent way. So impacts, dependencies, are core to the nature agenda, and then layered on top of impacts and dependencies are the risks that these pose to your organization and potentially the opportunities that they pose as well. Again, risks being more common at the moment than opportunities, but both are important. So, impacts, dependencies, risks, opportunities, that is the intellectual core of this debate. And thankfully, I think we're getting consensus across the nature space for that to be a consistent language that we use going forward.
Good, thank you. That was a really helpful breakdown of those terms and the context they're in. So, one of the services that Natcap provides is access to nature based data insights. And we already discussed in the first part, the difficulties of accessing data across your supply chain, which you touched upon. But could I ask you to provide a bit more your opinion on what the challenges and opportunities of gathering and communicating nature based data are for companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're starting on this journey, you want to start measuring where you stand on nature, you want to start reporting on it, hopefully, you want to start acting on it. It's a meaningfully more complex challenge than it was for climate. And that's because, as we already mentioned, nature is location specific. So, where your operational supply chain are matters. It's because there isn't a single metric here, like with climate, where you can just measure carbon. Here, there are many metrics. It's because it's new and they in the different elements of nature interact in a way that's quite complex. And so all of this makes it a more challenging topic than climate. What we kind of end up doing is we've built a platform that provides all the data you need to measure nature, aligning closely with the framework CSRD and TNFD, but can go beyond that. Um, and this is tens of metrics brought together in one place so that companies have access to all that data at once. And the thing that we see that is really hard is firstly just knowing what on earth to be measuring. There's so many
Yeah.
potential metrics. I think there's a few thousand out there that pertain to measure nature. So what on earth are the very few that are sensible and appropriate for your business to measure based on where you operate, what industry you're in, and what you want to achieve with the exercise? Then what are the best data sets to measure that? And not just the raw data, but how do you process that data to threshold and interpret it? So,
Mhm.
just knowing that the biodiversity and intactness of a site is X is not very meaningful. What you need to know is a reference point and some thresholds to understand whether you should act on that data or not. So the second thing is actually thresholding and interpreting that data. And then aligning all of those outputs in a way that meet your needs. Usually at this stage, it's the TNFD CSRD frameworks to enable reporting, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a claim you want to make to your customers, or it could be an internal supplier dashboard to help your supply chain management team make better decisions. How do you then turn that data into a format that meets those needs? So those are the type of problems: selecting what to measure, bringing the best data to measure it, manipulating it to help you interpret it, and then aligning it all in a way that makes sense for what you need to do with it. That's really what we focus on doing and what we've built software to answer.
Yeah, so your website mentions that you're experts in pollution, water, and biodiversity. So are these areas the main ones that you focus on when providing data and helping companies make a nature based strategy?
Yeah, there's a few ways of categorizing the nature space. Pollution, water, and biodiversity are the three standards in CSRD.
Yeah.
So for we found that a lot of companies think in those terms, and we're certainly experts in all three. There are other ways of cataloging nature, and broadly, we've built a team based in scientific excellence that can cover the broad agenda in however your business wants to define it. So, we've brought some brilliant hydrologists and ecologists and agricultural experts all on the team so that we're flexible in across different thematic areas. But pollution, water, and biodiversity is how the EU's define it, and that works for us.
Great. Thank you. Well, to finish off part two, I wanted to come back to the quote of yours that I read out at the beginning of part one, which is: My career has been focused on trying to make our economic system more sustainable. I hope to leave this planet in a better place than I found it. So, could I ask you to summarize again why it's so important for companies or other entities to prioritize nature and why you've chosen to make it, the focus of your business and your career?
Yeah. Well, look again. There's a heart and a wallet answer, and
I
and
really like this. I'm going to start using this heart and wallet. Yeah.
and the wallet maybe we'll start with this time, which is future cash flows depend on the resilience of our ecosystem to provide ecosystem services to businesses. This is not some tree hugger agenda. This is critical to how you operate. And we've already breached 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. and are on track to breach many more. So there is a critical, sizable, financial, quasi-existential risk here for business from the collapse of nature that just can't be ignored any longer. And there's a bit of a meta problem here in the sustainability space, which is people have been shouting about these crises for a few decades now, and they've been shouting because they are urgent, and the things that folks have been worrying would happen have happened, and they're devastating. And so there is a logic to continually shouting about things. But then equally, if you shout all the time, you eventually lose some of your punch. So that's the dilemma we're in. This nature crisis, the more you read about it, the more frustrated you get, the more urgent it feels. And it's not just from a heart perspective, it's a wallet perspective, because businesses critically depend on these ecosystem services. So we do have to shout about it, and the consequences are real, and the time to address it is increasingly running out. And I went to a brilliant conference the other day at the Royal Society here in London, and Paul Polman was speaking, and he quoted someone. So I'm going to quote him in turn, saying, that man is the most insane creature. We worship an invisible God and destroy a visible planet, but we don't realize the visible planet is the invisible God we worshipped in the first place. And I think that's a nice way of ending things here, which is we are doing untold harm to the planet. We have a chance to fix it. And it feels that the evidence is overwhelming that that's the right thing to do.
That's a fantastic quote to end on. Thank you very much. I think I will just add that I think for too long, businesses haven't seen the impact that it will have on their business. It isn't just a question of we're profit at all costs, so we're going to do what we can. Well, if you do what you can unchecked without measuring your impacts, there won't be a business for you at the end of the day. And if you want to continue that, well, then yes, take care of the visible planet, as you just said, Seb. Thank you. Thank you, Sebastian, for joining us today for part 2. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.